All right, good evening, everybody. For those who do not know me, my name is Travis Milliman. I oversee the Natural Sciences collection here at Greenwich Library. Before we get started with our guest, Dr. Nate J. Dominy, I wanted to give a few quick plugs for things that are coming up. Um, so firstly, staying in the STEAM world, we do have our Innovator in Residence going on every Friday at 3 p.m. This includes December 27th, so if you have off at that time and can't usually come because of the work week, feel free to stop by that day. Then on Monday, December 23rd at 6 p.m., we have another round of Broadway on a Budget. That'll be also a webinar. And then on the 31st, on New Year's Eve at 11:30 a.m., we have our new New Year's Eve countdown. So for those of you with kids, feel free to stop on by and we'll be counting down to noon. And it should be a wonderful time. Um, Without further ado, we're going to get started here. Our guest tonight is Dr. Nathaniel J. Dominy. He is an anthropologist and evolutionary biologist at Dartmouth College. He studies the behavior, ecology, and functional morphology of humans and non-human primates, and his research philosophy is to integrate tropical field work with mechanical, molecular, and isotopic analyses in order to better understand how and why adaptive shifts occurred during primate evolution. However, tonight he's going to tell us all about the biology of reindeer, and I have been looking forward to this for months. I'm so excited you were all here. So without further ado, Dr. Dominy, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Travis. I'm thrilled to be here and talking about Rudolph and the biology of reindeer. It's one of my favorite topics. So I can't wait to get into it. And please, if you have questions, at the end, I assume we'll have some time for Q&A, and I'm looking forward to it. So this story begins in 1939. Robert May, who was a Dartmouth graduate, he graduated in the class of 1926. So if any of you are Dartmouth alums out there, this is a fellow alumnus. And Robert May, he was a year younger than Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss graduated in the class of 1925. And so they all knew each other. And Robert May had moved to Chicago after graduating, and he started working for the Montgomery Ward department store. And so Robert May was the first person to think about Rudolph. He was the first person to see Rudolph. And this photograph here on your left is the actual galley proofs of the first publication of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And it was distributed to people visiting the department store initially, but it proved so popular that many years after that, they would sell copies. But first, let's talk a little bit about the word reindeer, because you might hear the word reindeer, you might hear the word caribou, and it's a little bit confusing. And so the answer to the question of whether Rudolph was a reindeer or a caribou is that he was both. There's just two different words for describing this particular animal. And you'll see there in North America, we typically use the word caribou, and that's because caribou is an indigenous First Nations word from the Micmac population. They are an indigenous population that live in the maritime provinces of Canada, and they call these animals kalipu, meaning snow shoveler. And so snow shoveler is something we'll return to later, so the name is very fitting. Elsewhere in the world, people use the word reindeer, which is a Scandinavian word. Rein meaning running, and deer is just a common word for animal, so it's a running animal. So reindeer and caribou are the same thing, and so Rudolph is both a reindeer and a caribou. So this is a drawing from Robert May's original book in 1939. We have it here at Dartmouth College in our special collections. And I just want to point out something special about the biology of reindeer, because male reindeer drop their antlers in the wintertime. And then they shed their antlers, and in the spring they regrow a new set of antlers. But female reindeer keep their antlers all year long. They never shed. And so Robert May, in this initial drawing, you'll see that Donner and Blitzen and some of the other reindeer, they all have antlers in the wintertime. So we know they're females. But Rudolph doesn't have antlers, so we know he's a male, he's a boy. Okay, so Rudolph's most prominent, most conspicuous feature is unquestionably his nose. And Robert May talks a lot about his nose and the tendency of other reindeer to make fun of Rudolph. They would tease him, and Rudolph felt very ashamed of his bright red nose. And there's this one scene from a book from my childhood that shows Rudolph hiding behind holly bush. And because his bright red nose blended in with the holly berries, he was able to hide himself a little bit from the other reindeer who were taunting him. And so this little clue, this little moment in Rudolph's life allows us to think a little bit about the color of his nose. And so we can look at holly berries today and we can measure their intrinsic color, the redness of the berry, and we can use a special instrument called a spectrometer, which measures the amount of light being reflected off the berry, which is the light that we see and understand as red. And so this plot shows you the holly berries, and it shows you how there's very little light between 350 and 550 nanometers. So there's no blue, there's no green, there's no yellow in this fruit at all. It is a very pure red color. And if we use that color to think about Rudolph's nose, then it turns out that that particular type of red is perfect for moving around under foggy conditions. So let's talk about the optics in a second. The question you're probably asking is, why was it red? Like, what was going on with Rudolph's nose to make it so red? And there are some ideas about this. So researchers have been using thermographic cameras that measure the heat emitting from animals, and they put these cameras on reindeer. And guess what? They found that the noses of reindeer were bright red. They're producing a lot of heat. And the explanation for this is that the nose is very important in winter. Reindeer need to be able to smell things under the snow. Remember, they're snow shovelers. And so the functionality of that nose is very important to maintain during the winter time. And so they have to put a lot of blood into that nose. And so they have a rich array of capillaries and arteries in the nose to keep it extremely warm, to keep it functioning in the wintertime. The problem, though, is that they lose a lot of heat through their nose. And so having a bright red nose is a little bit costly for them. They spend a lot of energy. It raises their metabolism pretty significantly. So just remember that redder noses require a lot more energy. So Rudolph has very high energetic needs. So at Christmas Eve, when you want to put out treats for Rudolph, remember cookies, chocolate milk, things with a lot of sugar, because he needs it to supply that bright red nose. Now, here's another thermographic image of that nose. And so that warmer color, that yellower color, shows that there's more heat coming from the nose. And there's a lot of heat coming from the eyes as well. Some scholars have actually thought that maybe he had an infection in his nose, that maybe there were parasites or something going on in his nose, and that was why it was so hot. I personally don't think that's true, but some researchers have raised that possibility. Okay, so we don't know why it was red. There might have been an infection. It might be just a natural part of reindeer biology to have a lot of blood going into the nose, but for whatever the reason was, Rudolph was pretty exceptional, and his nose was much brighter than most other reindeer. And this is something that Robert May noticed in 1939. This is an image from his original book showing Rudolph's bright red nose. And this is just worth reading his text. He was quite the poet. He said, "The rest of the night, well, what would you guess? Old Santa's idea was a brilliant success." I thought that's a nice use of the word brilliant, because the nose was so brilliant, producing light so that the Santa and the reindeer could navigate under really foggy conditions. Now, in the Arctic, fog isn't normal fog. Fog is often ice fog. So the kind of fog that we see in Connecticut and in New England is typically normal fog, where the fog is suspended water droplets. But under really cold conditions, it can actually be suspended ice crystals. And the problem with fog, as you're well aware, is that it's hard to see through fog, because light, when it goes through fog, it hits those water droplets or those crystals and it scatters. And so that's why it's so opaque and so difficult to see through. And so the red nose, now that we know the color of Rudolph's red nose, we can calculate how far that red light would travel under foggy conditions. And guess what? It travels really well. In fact, there's no other color that will travel better in fog than Rudolph's red nose. And this is a familiar aspect of everyday life. That's the reason why brake lights on cars are red. It's because it's the best color for seeing through foggy conditions. It's why the runway lights at airports are red. It's so pilots can see the runway even under foggy conditions. So when visibility is at its worst, the best light is red light because it travels the farthest. Other colors of light, blues, greens, yellows, they will hit those water droplets, they'll hit those ice crystals, and they'll scatter, and they're attenuated, is what we'd say. They just don't travel nearly as far. So red light is the best light. So Rudolph's nose was unequivocally the best kind of nose to have for navigating under foggy conditions. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about Rudolph's nose, but there's so many more interesting things going on in Rudolph's body. And one way to talk about his vision under foggy conditions is to talk a little bit about light in the Arctic. And one of the very curious things about Arctic light is just how blue it is. Arctic light is profoundly blue in color, and this photograph really highlights that. So why is the Arctic so blue? Well, this phenomenon is related to the ozone layer. You've probably heard about the ozone layer. You've probably heard about holes in the ozone layer. But the ozone layer, it's extremely important. It blocks very damaging kinds of radiation, but it's incredibly thin. It's only 3 millimeters thick. So it's a tiny fraction of the stratosphere. 3 millimeters, by the way, is the equivalent of 2 pennies stacked one on the other. So it's extremely thin. And so when light is, so in this image of the globe here, you can imagine, you see South America, the continent. So if you were, say, standing in Brazil and the sun was directly overhead, the sunlight would have only 3 millimeters of ozone to travel through. But if you were at an oblique angle, like say you were in Africa and the sun was setting, then that sunlight has to travel through marginally more ozone than if it was at directly overhead. And one way to think about this, if you're kids, when I was a kid, I used to like oranges, and I would poke a straw through the orange. So the best way to poke a straw through the orange is directly perpendicular to the surface. And then it goes through the least amount of peel. But if you were to try to poke that straw through the orange at an oblique angle, then it would travel through more of the peel, even though the thickness of the peel is the same all the way around. So that's the basic principle. And this is important because ozone has a really funny property. It blocks green light, preferentially blocks green light. And so blue light and purple light passes through, no problem. Red light passes through, no problem. And this is one of the explanations for why at dawn and dusk, when the sun is rising or setting, the light in the environment, the light in the sky tends to be very purpley and red. It's never green. And so because the Arctic is at a very high latitude and because the Earth is tilted, it means the sunlight hitting the Arctic is passing through relatively large amounts of ozone, which is blocking that green light. And the result is light that is really enriched in blue and purple colors. And so this is a good example of sunset at an Arctic village. And this is a photograph by Stephen Gorman. He's a really prominent photographer, and he happens to be my neighbor here in Norwich, Vermont. And this is a great photo for showing that rich blue color that prevails at these very high Arctic latitudes. And, for most of us, twilight is kind of a fleeting phenomenon. Twilight is 15, 25 minutes tops. But in the Arctic, between September and April, 8 to 11 hours of every day is twilight. And researchers call this extended twilight. It's basically the idea that the ambient conditions are pretty much twilight all the time. And it stands to reason that animals living in these conditions are going to evolve a visual system or a biology that's well suited for operating under this very blue colored light. Okay, so blue light. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is called a tapetum lucidum, which is kind of a fancy word for something that means a shining carpet. And it's a term for a structure in the eye that is a compressed layer of collagen that functions like a mirror. And each of these animals, so this crocodile, these raccoons, and this is a lemur on the right, do you notice how the eyes are shining? It's because someone has a flashlight, and the flashlight is shining on their eyes, and the light is going into the eye, and then it's hitting that mirror-like reflective surface, and then bouncing back toward the person taking the photograph. And this is a really common phenomenon. If you've been driving at night, you probably see the green eye shine of deer. If you pull into your driveway in your house and your dog or your cat is crossing the driveway and the headlights of your car shine into its eyes, you might notice that they have a very bright orange color. So it's a common thing. Many mammals, many vertebrates have a tapetum lucidum, this eye shine. And what it does is it gives the receptors in the eye a second opportunity to absorb a photon of light. Because at night, photons of light are really rare, they're scarce. And so you want a visual system that can maximize the chance of capturing those scarce photons so that the brain can form a visual image. So tapetum lucidums are extremely common among animals that are active at night. And we call those animals nocturnal animals. Now, we humans, we don't have one. So it's not something we're familiar with. But deer and reindeer, they have a tapetum lucidum. But the really funny, or it's not funny, the really strange and puzzling and surprising thing about reindeer is that their tapetum lucidum actually changes color. And this was discovered in Sweden. Drivers would notice that reindeer in the summer, when their headlights of their cars would shine on their eyes, they had a sort of an autumn golden green kind of color. And that's a very typical color for ungulates like reindeer. But then the real surprising thing was that in the winter months, the color of their eye shine, the color of their tapetum changed to blue, like a liquescent, watery blue. It was a really striking phenomenon. And researchers went and they found out that it was true, that this urban legend reported by Swedish drivers was in fact true. They could show that the color of the tapetum was different at these different times of the year. And they actually figured out how it works. It's because the pressure inside the eye expands during different months and it compresses that layer of tissue, changing its reflective properties. So they figured out how it works. But reindeer, to date, reindeer are the only animals we know of where the tapetum lucidum can actually change color. And we think that's important. That's important for its biology because remember I said blue light is common in the winter, and now they have a blue tapetum lucidum. That would suggest that blue is really important. That's a really important kind of light to capture and see to make decisions. So here's a photograph of a reindeer under snowy conditions in the Arctic at winter. And what I'm doing is I've highlighted the color of its tapetum. It's a blue tapetum. And if you'll notice the sky just above that hillside, it's also a blue color that's almost identical to the color of the tapetum. And so this has caused a lot of interest among researchers. So they started measuring the color of the sky and measuring the color of the tapetum to try to understand why these two things seem to match. And here's a scientific figure to show you how well they match. So that color of light in the sky is represented by that really jaggedy black curve. And on the that's an irradiance spectrum. That's a way we measure light. And you'll see that it's peaking around 350 to 400 nanometers, which is what we'd call blue. Now, those solid lines, the blue one, the green one, the red one, represent different parts of the tapetum lucidum. And then that black line represents the average of those three different areas of the tapetum lucidum in the eye. And what you'll notice is that the peaks of the jaggedy line is a really close match to the peaks, the reflectance peaks of the tapetum. So it's just so close, it's almost perfect. So it looks like the color of their eyes is a really close match to the color of the sky at winter. Okay, so it's one thing to have a tapetum that reflects blue light. So it seems like the eye really wants to capture blue light. For whatever reason, blue light's important for reindeer. Well, there's another really puzzling discovery that emerged in the last few years about reindeer vision. And it concerns ultraviolet. Now, UV, ultraviolet vision, is a relatively common phenomenon in animals generally, but it's not something familiar to us. So I just want to show you this figure, which is showing variation in energy from very short wavelengths, we call those gamma rays or X rays, and then really long wavelengths, we call those radio waves or microwaves. But there's a certain wavelengths that we can actually see, and we call that visible light. This is the energy we can detect with our eyes. And that visible light ranges from 400 to 700 nanometers, from a deep indigo purple all the way up to red. And that covers the range of light that we can see. But at slightly shorter wavelengths that we cannot see, we call them ultraviolet. So anything between 350 and 400 nanometers is a type of light that we cannot see. And so we define it as ultraviolet because it's beyond our human capability. Reddish light that we can't see, we call infrared. And there are even some animals that can detect infrared. So in other words, the world we see is so familiar to us, but there are animals out there that can see things that we can't using their vision. And birds and bees are examples of animals that have receptors in their eye that are sensitive to ultraviolet light. Now, at the bottom, I'm showing you a picture of a flower. This is just an ordinary daisy. You can find these in New England, anywhere. You can find these in Connecticut. And to us, to humans, it looks bright yellow. And that's the right half of that flower. But the left half of that flower is being photographed with a UV sensitive camera. And you'll notice it has that very dark blob right in the center. And many flowers have those dark blobs, and they're a little bit like a bullseye. And we call them nectar guides. They're guides for bees because bees can see that darkened area and they know that's where the nectar is, and that's what the bees are looking for. And so flowers would use these traits to attract bees, and then the bees pollinate the flowers. So there's a visual world out there that we just don't understand. We need specialized equipment like UV sensitive cameras and other kinds of instruments to detect these patterns. Okay, now I'm showing you an arrangement of living mammals on Earth today. And what these researchers did, it was a very clever paper where they painted the branches leading to individual species. They painted them with the color that corresponds to the sensitivity of that receptor in the eye. So if they are sensitive to ultraviolet light, it's got like a lavender color on the branch. If the animal is sensitive to ordinary blue light, like you and me, then it's got a blue branch. And if the animal has lost its ability to see any short wavelengths, then it has a gray branch. And so what you'll see, I know it's a big figure with a lot of tiny text, but the point is to show you that many mammals have that lavender branch. That lavender branch has a very deep ancestry, and we think the earliest mammals probably had UV sensitive vision. I'm just going to zoom in here, and you'll see that there's a lot of blue branches on the primates. So we primates dispensed with UV vision a long time ago, and all the primates alive today are sensitive to blue light. This is something we've inherited from our primate ancestors. There's a handful of primates you'll notice that have gray branches, meaning they've lost their ability to see blue, and they actually see in black and white only. Okay? So just above the primates, you'll see there's some rodents. A lot of them are sensitive to UV light, and they're nocturnal. Just below the primates, there's a lot of bats. Bats are nocturnal, and many bats are sensitive to UV light. So now what I'm going to do is scroll down. I want you to look at near the bottom of this figure. And the first thing I want you to look at is the dolphins and the whales. You see all that clustering of gray branches? They've all lost their ability to see blue. So for dolphins, whales, and seals, the ocean is not blue. They can't see blue. They can only see in black and white. And the explanation for this is that they don't need to see color because they dive deep into the water, and there's very little light at the depths that they dive to, and so there's very little reason to preserve this ability to discriminate color. Now, just below the dolphins and whales, you have closely related ungulates, and one of them is the reindeer. Do you see the animal on the right with the big antlers? That's Reindeer tarandus, and that's our reindeer/caribou. And so reindeer, like all of these other ungulates, like giraffes and okapis and bison and cattle, they all see blue, just like primates do, primarily because they're active in the daytime. They're diurnal animals. Okay. So how do I reconcile this? I just said that reindeer see UV, and now I'm showing you this plot that suggests that their opsin, the protein in their eye, is sensitive to blue color. Well, it's really interesting. So this is a reindeer eye. It's in it's accessioned in the British Museum, and I've just rotated it, and it's cut in cross section. And that layer of tissue at the very front of the eye is a tissue that we call the cornea. So if you wear contact lenses, you put them right onto that layer of tissue called the cornea. Right behind it, that round tissue that looks a little bit like a marble, that's the lens. And so light is transmitted through the cornea, and the main function of the cornea is to curve light, to bend it. We use the word refraction. That's why it's curved. And then the function of the lens is to bend it even further. And so in humans, we want those tissues to be transparent. We want the light to transmit, but we don't want UV light hitting our retinas. And so in people, those two tissues, those ocular tissues, they block UV light. Now, there's lots of anecdotes. Maybe you've watched the movie A Christmas Story recently, and remember the mother keeps saying you'll shoot your eye out. Well, this would happen. Kids would have their lenses shot with BB guns, and they would replace the lens with an ordinary glass lens, and that glass lens could transmit UV light. And so there was a whole history of children with one eye they could see in UV, and the other eye they couldn't. It was solely because UV light was being transmitted through a glass lens. So the really puzzling thing, let's get back to reindeer. The really puzzling thing about reindeer is that their cornea and their lens transmit UV light. And those opsins in the eye that are sensitive to blue can absorb a little bit of that UV light. And so reindeer, even though their eyes are sensitive to blue, because those tissues are transparent in the UV, they can actually detect UV light and use it to make decisions. It's the only animal we know of that has this, it's the only large diurnal mammal that we know of that has this special feature. So just to recap, there's a lot of interesting things going on in the reindeer visual system. Not only does their tapetum change color with the seasons, but they can actually transmit UV light and see it and inform a visual image with the UV light. Now, just think for a second about the snowy conditions they're under, because UV light can damage us, and we call it snow blindness. So it's important to protect your eyes when you're out under very bright conditions in a snowy cover, because the sunlight has a lot of UV light. It reflects off the snow into your eyes, and it can cause damage. But there's no reported instance of snow blindness in reindeer. So not only are they transmitting UV light, but they have some special power to protect the eyes from photo damage. Okay, so I know it's hard to think about UV light. It's hard to imagine something that we ourselves can't see. But luckily, there's cameras that can transmit UV light and form an image. So here's a photograph from my just near my house in Vermont. It's from the springtime. And if you look at the top image, you'll see the distant mountains. Those are the foothills of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. And I just want you to note that the snow cover is extremely bright, right? This is familiar. And then the sky above looks blue to us, but there's a lot of UV light in that sky. So now let's pop down to the image below. And now we're looking at the UV component of that photograph. And so you notice that the tree in the foreground, the maple trees, are extremely dark. The trees in the distance are extremely dark, but the snow and the sky are very similar in color in this UV image. And that's because the snow is a very good reflector of the UV component coming from the sky. Whereas plant matter is strongly absorbent in the UV. So if I was an animal and I was able to see UV light, I could navigate through this photograph in the bottom very easily. I would quickly know the difference between sky, snow, and vegetation. So one of the big questions that's driving a lot of interest in reindeer biology right now is, why do they need to see UV? And one possibility is right here in this photograph. You see, that's a wolf. That's an Arctic wolf. And it's common for Arctic wolves to have a white fur during the winter. Now, to you and me, that is a white animal on a white landscape. So that's chromatic camouflage. It would be difficult for us humans to see a wolf that's stationary and that might want to pounce on us. But if you can see UV, then the idea is that you can more easily detect that wolf because the hair on the wolf absorbs UV light, whereas the snow reflects it. So here's a photograph. This is a husky, a neighboring husky on the left. And I just want you to focus on the white fur. It's on the photograph, the top photograph, the white fur and the white snow are relatively similar. But in the UV photograph below, the white fur and the snow are much more distinctive. There's a much stronger contrast between the white fur and the snow and the lower photograph. Now, the dog on the right, that's my own dog. That's Ruby. She's a golden doodle. And it's a little bit more clear in that photo. She's also white, but you'll see that her fur looks much darker in the UV than the snow that's behind her. So one hypothesis is that the reason why reindeer need to see blue very well, and the reason why they need to see UV, is so they can spot those wolves on the landscape, and they can quickly just differentiate the wolves from the snow. Whereas for us, it might be more challenging. Now, but that's not the only idea that's been put out there. The other really puzzling thing about reindeer is that they eat lichens. And lichens are an astounding life form. It's actually, we had to invent a new word to describe the relationship between the algae and the fungi that are living together in lichens. And that word was symbiosis. So it was in the 1870s, we had to invent an entirely new word to try to understand how two organisms from two different kingdoms could coexist in this mutual fashion. So the algae, they photosynthesize, they produce sugars, the fungi is getting proteins, and then they exchange them. So these two organisms are working together. And now, by the way, it's even more astounding because now there's bacteria in the party too. And so it's actually three different kingdoms all coexisting and living as a single entity. It's an amazing thing. Now lichens, so the top left photograph, that is known as the bearded lichen, and it's really common in New England. You have it in Connecticut. I'm sure you've seen it in your backyards. And this is it grows from the branches of trees, and it's a favorite food item for deer. Now the photograph just to the right of it is that exact same bearded lichen, but it's taken with the UV camera. And you'll notice how dark it is. So it's bright white in ordinary vision, and then under UV vision, it's extremely dark. And so it's been argued that because reindeer can eat a lot of lichens, in fact, they are the largest animal to subsist so heavily on lichens. This is something that really differentiates them from almost every other animal on Earth. Maybe they're using their UV vision to detect those dark patches. So if there's dark lichens on the landscape, it should be very conspicuous to them when viewed against the snow. Now, the bottom images, that's a different kind of lichen. That's the scaly kind of lichen that you might see on the surfaces of rocks, for example. Squamose is the word we would use to describe it. That's kind of a flat growing style. And that's a kind of an interesting one because it actually reflects UV. So lichens have different growth forms. They're tremendously diverse, and some of them absorb UV light and some of them reflect UV light. It's a really interesting pattern. And so those plots on the right, those are spectral reflectance curves. So it's measuring the amount of light across different wavelengths that is being reflected off the lichens. And Usnea hirta, that's the bearded lichen, and you'll just see in that UV range between 300 and 400, very little reflection. And then if you shift all the way down to the bottom plot, the bottom right, you'll see that some of those curves are actually lifting off. There's a non-negligible amount of UV light being reflected from these lichens. So there's some interesting variation going on in lichens. And next time you go outside, check out the lichens. They're really, really fascinating organisms. Okay, but that's not what reindeer eat the most of. What they're actually eating are lichens that grow from the ground. These are ground dwelling lichens. The word is fruticose for describing them. And it's a little bit like a shag carpet, if you can think of it that way. And this reindeer has found a patch of lichens on the landscape. And the reindeer is shoveling the snow. Some biologists call it cratering. And so, reindeer, you can imagine if you're a reindeer looking at this landscape and you see in a distance a blackened patch, you know right away, oh, there's lichens. That's my favorite food. And what it does is it saves you energy. You don't have to wander in zigzags searching for it. If you can see it from a distance, then you can economize the cost of moving toward it. And we think that would provide them a big advantage. So having UV vision may allow you to spot food from a distance under these conditions where there's just a lot of snow. So I went to Scotland a year ago, and I was really interested in this phenomenon. There's reindeer in Scotland. And this is in the Cairngorm mountain range. It's a national park right in the very center of Scotland. And it was in the springtime, so I was lucky to get there was still some snow left on the mountains. And that you see the snow there. And then right in the foreground is a patch of this kind of lichen that I'm talking about. It's growing from the ground and it's extremely thick. It's like 4 or 5 inches thick. It's like a bed of lichens. Now, in the United States, we tend to call the lichen to the right there, the paler colored one, we call it reindeer moss. Now, it's not moss, it's lichen, but it looks a little bit like moss. And it's called reindeer moss in part because reindeer love it. And we've known for a long time that reindeer really like this particular type of lichen. So I was really curious to find areas where the lichen was growing next to a patch of snow. And so the image above at the top left is showing you the UV image, showing just how bright the snow is, right? It's reflecting UV light is super bright, but that patch of lichens is extremely dark. And so I think that this photograph illustrates the principle that if a reindeer is out there on the landscape and it's trying to find food, it can look for those differences. The bright and darkness combined is going to tell it that there's a potential patch of lichens there. So what I did is I measured the reflectance properties of snow at different depths, and you see those in the top right panel. You'll see that you see how reflective snow is. So thick snow can reflect 85, 90% of the light that hits it. It's extremely reflective. And then the reindeer moss are those curves just below. And you'll see that they are fairly absorbent in the UV, although there is some reflectance in the UV. And then I went and found other versions of reindeer moss. So reindeer moss is a catch-all term, an umbrella term. There's many different species. They all look very similar. And so those three bottom panels are showing you different types of reindeer moss and just how strongly absorbent they are in the UV. So these are data that support this idea. They bolster the hypothesis that seeing UV might be really good for reindeer. Now, personally, I think food is pretty important, but many of my colleagues would say detecting predators and evading predators is important. And so there's kind of a debate in the literature right now of which is more important, finding food or avoiding predators. And honestly, it's probably a little bit of both. Okay, so I just want to wrap up and say, what did we learn from this talk? Well, the first thing we need to remember is that Rudolph's glowing red nose increases his metabolism. So that red nose isn't free. It costs a lot of energy to maintain a bright red nose. So kids at night on Christmas Eve, you want to put out really high energy snacks for Rudolph. He's going to need them. But the key thing about that red nose is it is also optimal. It's just perfect for producing light under foggy conditions. Like there's no better color of a nose for producing light under those challenging visual conditions. And then the last thing I want you to remember is that reindeer eyes are so unique. There's no other animal that has a visual system like reindeer. And moreover, it's extremely well suited for seeing food or predators against a snowy background, especially under purplish twilight, which is the dominant type of light in the Arctic. Okay, so I want to open it up for questions, and I also just want to invite anyone to reach out to me. My personal email address is there on the screen. But if you want to see references for any of the points that I made, or if you want PDFs of the articles, I am more than happy to send those to you by email. And yeah, I think I'll just stop there and invite questions.
All right, so folks, if you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat and I can go ahead and read them to Nate. But while folks are thinking, if I could just start with a question or two. So Nate, a lot of your research is also primate focused. So I was just curious what the connection going from primates to reindeer, or if it's a one-off, or what brought you to reindeer?
Well, my dissertation work. So I did my PhD in the late '90s, and I was working primarily in Uganda, and it was about color vision. That was my driving passion was primate color vision, and so that's my specialty is primate senses primarily, and so when these papers started to emerge about reindeer, it's just like they were just like head scratchers, right? They were just so puzzling. And I just found myself a little bit obsessed with reindeer. And then when I moved to Dartmouth College and realized that Dartmouth had this close connection with Rudolph, then I was like, all right, well, I gotta become a Rudolph biologist then for sure.
That's cool. Do you see any when you're and so you said that the reindeer the what they have going on in their eyes is completely and totally unique. But do you see in other ungulates, whether it's like something as common as like white-tailed deer or an elk or something like as crazy as like a muntjac, like do you see anything else that are like unique characteristics like that?
So I'm so glad you asked that question because the answer to that question, so there is, well, I don't know. We don't, researchers don't know. But the way to answer it is to study other animals that are also victims of wolves. So moose would be a really good one. Musk oxen that live in Greenland, they would be a really good animal. Roe deer in Scandinavian countries, they're also vulnerable to wolves. So if the adaptation in the visual system is really about detecting wolves on snow, then all of those other animals should have a similar visual system to reindeer. But if it's about finding food and only reindeer are eating lichens, then it wouldn't surprise me if reindeer are the only animals that have this special visual system. So I think the way to answer that question is to expand our search and look at some of these other animals and check out their eyes. I mean, we just never knew reindeer had such interesting eyes. It's only been in the last 10 years all this research has been coming out. So it's really exciting.
We have someone in the chat asking how similar white-tailed deer vision is to that of caribou. Is there any evidence of like white-tailed deer? You're saying that they eat lichen as well. Do they have any adaptations to help them with lichen?
So they're not eating the white-tailed deer would eat the lichens that are hanging from branches. They don't eat the carpets of lichens that we see reindeer eating. And no, as far as we know, their tapetum lucidum does not change with the seasons, and there is no transparency of UV light in their cornea and lens. So regular white-tailed deer and reindeer, uh, there's no similarity to their visual systems, I'm afraid.
But I think it's also cool to think about this for people in the chat. I mean, we think of just deer as deer, but their ungulates is a huge group of animals, and so the characteristics are all over the place, I'm sure.
But I'll just add that in the Pleistocene, so 10, 15,000 years ago, here in New England, we had caribou, we had reindeer. They extended into this area. So I was just like, sometimes when I go for hikes, I try to imagine what they would be eating here.
All right, so I'm going to tie things up here. So for those of you who enjoyed tonight, make sure you check out our Ultimate Ungulates book list that was attached to the event. This whole event was inspired by this really wonderful book I read called Reindeer Reflections by Dr. Jerry Haig, and it just opened my eyes to this very cool world. I hope everyone enjoyed this talk tonight. Tell your friends if you enjoyed that this is being recorded and it's going to be up on our YouTube page shortly. And Nate, thank you so much for talking tonight. This was excellent. So thanks again, Nate Dominy, and everyone have a wonderful night, and we hope to see you soon at the library.
Thanks, Travis. I had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.